Hi, I'm Taline, Artinian. I'm a philosopher based at the University of Exeter. I'm very pleased to be here today to talk about transpersonal gratitude and psychedelic altered states of consciousness. Gratitude is one of my main research interests, and my work has led me to look into philosophical accounts of dyadic and triadic contexts of gratitude. I have proposed the concept of transpersonal gratitude to account for genuine cases of thankfulness in the absence of an intentional benefactor. I'm also interested in the philosophy of psychedelics and consciousness, so today I will be discussing some phenomenological features of transpersonal gratitude to compare them to certain characteristics of psychedelic altered states of consciousness. I will start with a brief overview of some philosophical accounts of gratitude to emphasize the differences between dyadic and triadic contexts and to explain why it is important to have a coherent account of dyadic cases of thankfulness. I will then focus on transpersonal gratitude to talk about some of its phenomenological features, especially its transcendent dimension and the feelings of connectedness that come with the experience, to compare those to experiences of unity in psychedelic states of consciousness. And my hope with this examination is to, on the one hand, further our understanding of transpersonal gratitude and the way it impacts what Huxley called the reducing valve function, and on the other hand, to shed some light on the notion of ineffability that we often encounter in reports of altered states of consciousness. So traditionally, the philosophy of gratitude has been a triadic account of benefactor, beneficiary, and benefit. In this context, gratitude is a duty, an obligation, at times a virtue, considered under the more general umbrella of the virtues of generosity and justice. It's an important moral element in personal and social interactions. It is an encouragement of generous behavior, and it's also an expression of the beneficiary's virtuousness, their willingness, their ability to accept a gift that generates duties and obligations. An important notion here is the kind intention of the benefactor. As Seneca said, the benefit lies in the goodwill of him who gives them. So the gift is the kind intention of the benefactor, and this idea is still a cornerstone of philosophical examinations of gratitude. We can see it with Seneca, Cicero, Aquinas, Kant, Adam Smith, and others. And this kind intention matters in two crucial ways for philosophers. First of all, it's this intention that generates requirements of gratitude. If a benefit is bestowed by mistake or unwillingly, we cannot speak of obligations of gratitude. If I save someone's life by mistake, then we cannot say that they owe me any sort of gratitude. But if I save someone's life at some cost or risk to myself, then their lack of gratitude would be a moral failure. So it's this intention of the benefactor that allows us to say that the beneficiary has duties and obligations of gratitude, and they should express this gratitude towards the benefactor. So this intention makes gratitude targeted towards the benefactor. The second way in which the intention matters is that it's also considered to be at the root of the emotional response of gratefulness in the sense of triggering this emotional response. There is a recognition from the beneficiary of being chosen, of being favored by the benefactor, of being the target of their kind intention. And it's this recognition of being chosen in this way that triggers feelings of thankfulness. And so it is evident why the notion of the kind intention of benefactor in a triadic context is an important one. Kant even claimed that the primariness of this intention means that gratitude is a sacred duty. It's a duty that can never be completely discharged. It's a debt that we can never completely repay, because the kind intention of the benefactor came first, and this is something that can never be reciprocated. I'm focusing on this notion of intention here because it's relevant to the challenges that philosophers face when attempting to account for dyadic cases of gratitude. Contemporary philosophy is mostly reluctant to refer to gratitude in the absence of beneficence. The absence of the kind intentional benevolence undermines a theory of gratitude because by definition, according to this view, by definition, gratitude has to be directed targeted towards a benefactor. But my argument is exactly that this requirement of kind intention is not a necessary component of our understanding of gratitude. For the longest time, gratitude belonged to the sphere of moral philosophy and theology. The focus was on obligations and duties of gratitude on the one hand, and the requirements on benefactors on the other. The emotional aspect of gratitude was discussed only to the extent that it was an expression of the virtuousness of the recipient. So questions about the experiential aspect of gratitude, about the structure of the experience, the components of the experience, came much later, so starting with moral sentimentalism and then picked up by positive psychology. But we still need a coherent phenomenological account of gratitude, and we should be able to account for this experience in the absence of benevolent intention. Our current philosophical concept of gratitude is reminiscent of a triadic view of our place in the world. This view has evolved and it has changed, where at the time we lived in a man-God or God-world reality. Now we are often considering a reality where it's just man and the world. We are not in a necessarily triadic relationship with the universe anymore. So our concept of gratitude should reflect this, to properly refer to thankfulness both in the presence and in the absence of benevolent intention. Some philosophers, such as Sean McAleer, have suggested a propositional account of dyadic cases of gratitude. So this would be expressed as being grateful that something is the case. So I'm grateful that heroes exist, to give McAleer's example. But I think that this account doesn't give the benefit a central enough position to speak of gratitude, and it's also vulnerable to objections related to agency and intention. So I have proposed transpersonal gratitude, which is formulated as being grateful for my survival, for example, where the salience of the benefit replaces the requirement of intentional agency. I call it transpersonal gratitude to refer to the fact that this is a modality of gratitude that goes beyond the person. It is not targeted towards someone or something. And although it does have normative and moral implications, I will focus on some of its phenomenological features here that are relevant to experiences of unity in psychedelic states of consciousness. So what are those phenomenological features? We have to look at the properties, the perceived properties of the benefit, and how it becomes centrally significant, how it becomes salient in the experience of gratitude. In all cases of gratitude, personal and transpersonal, the benefit has to come from outside the self, and it cannot be something that a person has earned or has worked towards. Now I will follow appraisal theories of emotions, which suggest that an emotion evaluates an object of experience in terms of the subject's concerns. So gratitude in this sense is an emotion that evaluates there is an emotional aspect in gratitude that evaluates the benefit in terms of the recipient's desires or needs. And this makes the benefit personal, even in the absence of an intentional benefactor. But this is not enough to say that the benefit becomes central and very salient in the experience. And we have to take into consideration some other factors, namely what Philip Watkins called this element of surprise in gratitude in the good life, in gratitude and the good life. But I think we have to elaborate this concept, this notion further to speak of an element of unlikeliness. This is what makes a person feel somehow favored and triggers a grateful response. So unlike the unlikeliness of the benefit would be, for example, a sunny, warm day in the middle of a very harsh winter storm, which somehow allows me to survive. This is what makes the benefit not just personal but also salient and central. There is this awareness of what might not have been. So I call this a comparative stance. There is a realization that things could have been very different, and by they should have been very different, and yet they weren't. They were to my benefit. And this realization brings a sense of being favored, to use A.D.M. Walker's term, and this sense of being personally, significantly benefited that allows us to speak of gratitude in the absence of a benefactor. And I think such a centrally, personally significant benefit without a source is an event that calls on a sense of connectedness. So transpersonal gratitude has this dimension that is transcendent, that personal gratitude does not have. And I use the term transcendent here in the sense of Peterson and Seligman as, and I quote, as an experience of connection beyond the self with the world at large that reminds us of how small we are, but at the same time lifts us out of a sense of insignificance. So I think an experience of transpersonal gratitude, a benefit that is that comes from outside the self, does not come from a benefactor, and yet is personally significant, that triggers an awareness of what might not have been, also triggers a sense of being somehow favored and a sense of being part of something larger than the self, a sense of connectedness to the world at large. Now, to understand this experience of connectedness further, I think looking into some experiences of unity during psychedelic states of consciousness can help us further our understanding of the workings of transpersonal gratitude and its transcendent dimension. I'd like to note here that the experiences of unity that I'll be discussing are not exclusive or unique to psychedelic states of consciousness. We do encounter them in mystical experiences, for example. But my comparison stays focused on psychedelic states of consciousness, because mystical states necessarily entail this sacredness component, and this is not the case for psychedelic states or transpersonal gratitude. So feelings of unity with others, the world, and further are very commonly reported during and sometimes even after psychedelic experiences. And there are many studies that on the neural correlates of those feelings of unity, but I'm interested in the experiential, the phenomenological aspect of such mental events, marked by a loosening of ego boundaries and oceanic boundlessness. Oceanic boundlessness refers to feelings of unity with the world, a sense of limitlessness. It is an experience where the self identifies with the perceived boundlessness of all that there is. Ego dissolution, on the other hand, is a loosening and alteration of ego boundaries. In everyday waking consciousness, there seems to be a sense of separation between the individual self and the rest of the world. But this sense tends to weaken during psychedelic experiences and sometimes even disappear. Given the importance that we have come to attach to our sense of self, the ego dissolution is not always a pleasant experience. Although it is usually linked to feelings of interconnectedness, oceanic boundlessness, but it can also induce extreme anxiety if it is lived as fragmentation of the self and a loss of its integrity. I think that the examination of such negative experiences of ego dissolution, the panic of this sense of loss of integrity and fragmentation, can add to our understanding to our understanding of states of consciousness. Psychological research links them to the intensity of the dissolution. So if it's extreme, then it becomes threatening for the self. But I think that there's more to say here, philosophically speaking, about the experience of panic and the subject of experience. However, for now, I will focus on pleasant experiences of ego dissolution and oceanic boundlessness to compare them, uh, to compare this sense of expanded self to experiences of connectedness in transpersonal gratitude, which is also a predominantly pleasant, positive experience. In fact, I will follow up on one of Huxley's suggestions that psychedelics and other experiences can inhibit what he called the reducing valve, to propose that transpersonal gratitude is one of those other experiences, even if it has a less intense impact than psychedelics. But while we have considerable data suggesting that psychedelics do have an impact on the brain similar to inhibiting the reducing valve, we don't have any neurological studies on transpersonal gratitude yet. So I will draw a parallel between the reducing valve and the ego in psychoanalytical theories, and refer to that conceptual framework to examine how this dyadic modality of gratitude affects the reducing valve function by loosening the boundaries of the ego. We are all more or less familiar with Freud's account of the human psyche in terms of the id and the ego, the former unconscious and operating under the pleasure principle of instant gratification, magical thinking, and the latter conscious operating under the reality principle, negotiating and integrating the demands of the internal and the external world. What is not always discussed is that Freud initially theorized the ego as a neural mass, and the secondary and the primary and secondary processes as neural energy in the brain. So he theorized about inhibition mechanisms in the brain. He did not have the necessary technology to test his theory, but nowadays neuroscience and incidentally research into ego dissolution during psychedelic experiences is pointing at some neural correlates of the ego. So the ego refers to mechanisms of inhibition and control. And when the hold of the ego weakens, the primary process is discharged into waking consciousness. This is marked by distorted perceptual distortions, hallucinations, magical thinking, intense emotions, etc. And we see similar distortions in psychedelic and other altered states of consciousness. So they all seem to entail a weakening of the ego's boundaries and its filtering and controlling mechanisms. So within this conceptual framework borrowed from psychoanalysis and psychedelic experiences, we can theorize about the way transpersonal gratitude impacts the ego. We have to return to the salience and personal significance of the benefit to do this. A benefit that is unexpected, unlikely, and personally significant, and yet has no source, creates considerable tension for the ego, because it's a pleasure that cannot be coherently negotiated in terms of the external world. The demands of the external world are unclear, and there's no social, religious, or other contexts to regulate the experience and its expression. This challenge of the perception of the external world unsettles the organizational principle of the psyche, which is the ego. The hold of the ego weakens as a result, and this produces a distortion of boundaries of the self, of the ego, and feelings of connectedness to others and the world at large. So transpersonal gratitude, similar to psychedelics, inhibits this inducing valve function of the ego. I'm not suggesting an equivalence of intensity, but a similarity in features that relate to experiences of unity. So insights from our understanding of psychedelics shed some light on the workings of transpersonal gratitude in terms of the transcendent dimension and how the experience impacts the reducing valve function. But is there anything that we can learn from our concept of transpersonal gratitude that help us further our understanding of psychedelic altered states of consciousness? Now, transpersonal gratitude isn't a radical departure from everyday consciousness in the same way as psychedelic experiences are. But I still think that some considerations from transpersonal gratitude allow us to comment on the notion of ineffability. Ineffable is a rather paradoxical term. It refers to something that cannot be referred to, and yet ineffability says something about the quality of certain psychedelic experiences and other altered states of consciousness. But my attempt here is not to discuss what ineffability is, but I'm interested in asking why we discuss ineffability. Why is this a quality that stays with the subject even after return to ordinary consciousness, and why does it appear to be important enough to mention? So to say about an experience that it is ineffable, it's not just to say that it cannot be put into words. It's also to say that there's something important about this property of the experience, that it is ineffable. So it's not only that it can't be put into words, but this means something to the subject. And so what is this significance? I think this is where some considerations from transpersonal gratitude can help us. So I mentioned the comparative stance in relation to transpersonal gratitude, and a realization and awareness of what might not have been. And I think that something similar can be said about this notion of ineffability when it comes to altered states of consciousness. And I think it can be formulated as a comparative awareness of what can be. The notion of ineffability represents the radical distinction between ordinary consciousness and altered states of consciousness, and it stays with the subject as such, as a representation of that radical distinction. It's a point of reference for what consciousness is, what consciousness can be. It's a conceptual placeholder for what lies beyond language, and to borrow a Lacanian term, outside, beyond systems of significance, of what lies outside of language. And so it stays with the subject as a representation of this radical distinction between ordinary consciousness and altered states of consciousness, and what this says about who we are and what we are. So does this add to our understanding of ineffability of certain psychedelic experiences? Not in any descriptive terms, but it does tell us something about the importance of the experience and the desire to experience what cannot be put into words. So we see that the examination of similarities between transpersonal gratitude and certain features of transpersonal gratitude and psychedelic altered states of consciousness adds to our understanding of transpersonal gratitude and the ego, and does shed some light on the notion of ineffability. But more than that, I think this examination shows the importance of such investigations, the investigation of such alignments, such similarities between altered states of consciousness on the one hand and experiences that are mostly grounded in ordinary consciousness but exhibit features of altered states, can make a significant contribution to our understanding of both. This is important because we are rethinking our social reality, our relationships to others, to our environment, and generally our place in the world. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to our discussions during the panels and the workshops.